My name is Willa, and if you've ever felt invisible at work, if you've ever poured your soul into a project only to watch someone else sign their name to it, then you need to hear this. It helps to know I'm not just screaming into the void, so if my story resonates with you, let me know in the comments. Your story matters too. For 7 years, I was the ghost in the machine at Monroe Architectural. I was the junior architect who lived on stale coffee and the hum of a rendering farm at 3 in the morning. He was Monroe, the visionary, the name on the door. He had the handshake, the smile, and a remarkable talent for presenting my work as his own. I was the engine, he was the polished hood ornament. I told myself it was part of the process. I told myself it was paying my dues, but the truth is, I was in his shadow for so long, I think I forgot what the sun felt like. The final act, the betrayal that broke the spell, was the Skyline Tower. It wasn't just another building, it was the kind of landmark project that defines a city's silhouette and an architect's career. It was a legacy cast in steel and glass, and every beam, every pane, every single graceful curve of its structure was born in my mind and on my computer. I spent 18 months of my life breathing that design. It was more than a job, it was a piece of my soul. I knew the precise tensile strength of the steel in its core, the exact shade of the non-reflective coating on its glass, the way the light would fall in the atrium at the winter solstice. When the final presentation to the city and the investors was scheduled, I assumed I'd be there in the back running the slides. That's how it always was. Monroe would stand in the spotlight, and I would be his silent prompter, but this time was different. I wasn't even invited. I watched it on a live stream, sitting at my own desk, the one where the design was created. He stood in front of a massive screen showing my renderings, my intricate CAD drawings, my vision of the future. He never said my name. He used the word I 47 times. I counted. He spoke of his inspiration, of the sleepless nights he spent wrestling with the engineering challenges. The applause was deafening. The investors were ecstatic. The city council was eating out of his hand. And in that moment, watching him bathe in the glow of my stolen light, I didn't say a word. I didn't stand up. I didn't send a furious email to the partners. I just sat there, my knuckles white on my keyboard, and I felt a strange and terrible calm settle over me. He didn't know my secret. He didn't know that my real signature wasn't a name, but a pattern. In the master CAD files, the ones sent directly to the steel fabricators, I had embedded a unique non-structural flaw, a tiny mathematically precise sequence in the arrangement of the steel reinforcements on the upper floors. To any human eye, any standard inspection, it was just rebar. It was noise, but he didn't know about my anonymous tip, sent from a ghost email account to the city's most feared and respected engineering auditor. A tip that suggested a full-spectrum deep resonance scan on floors 40 through 45 due to a suspected material anomaly. He didn't know that my so-called flaw, when viewed through the lens of that specific high-frequency scan, wasn't a flaw at all. It was a scannable QR code, a digital ghost in his perfect machine. And that QR code linked to a private time-stamped portfolio containing every file, every draft, every email, and every single piece of evidence, proving my sole authorship of the Skyline Tower. It also linked to a video, a confession I pre-recorded, a calm, detailed account of the last 7 years. The final piece of the puzzle was timing. That deep structural scan, the kind required for final city certification of a skyscraper of this magnitude, was scheduled for the day before the grand opening gala, the day before Monroe was set to cut the ribbon and cement his legacy forever. He thought he was building a monument to himself. He had no idea he was actually building the stage for my vindication. He mistook my silence for acceptance. He mistook my patience for passivity. He never understood that architects, the real ones, know that the most important work is done before anyone ever sees the building. We build the foundation, and this foundation was built to crack on my command. The applause from the live stream echoed in my cheap headphones, a tinny, distant sound that felt like it was coming from another planet. I closed the browser window, plunging my office into the quiet hum of the server room down the hall. For a long moment, I just stared at the reflection of my face on the dark screen. I looked tired. I looked like someone who had given too much and been left with too little. The anger I expected to feel wasn't there. The hot, righteous fury I had fantasized about for years was absent. In its place was a stillness, a profound and hollow cold that started in my stomach and spread through my limbs until I felt like I was made of ice. This wasn't a sudden break. It was the final, slow-motion crumbling of a dam that had been cracking for years. I had felt the tremors, the small, hairline fractures of disrespect and dismissal that over time threatened the integrity of the entire structure. I thought back to the beginning. My first project with Monroe, the Peterson Annex, a small but technically complex addition to a historic library. I was 2 years into my tenure at the firm, still bright-eyed and desperate to prove myself. I'd solved a critical load-bearing issue that had stumped the senior team by using a cantilevered truss system inspired by a Calatrava bridge I'd studied in college. It was elegant, efficient, and saved the client $250,000. I worked for 3 straight weeks, sleeping on a cot in the office, modeling every possible stress point. When the time came to present the solution to the client, Monroe walked into my cubicle, picked up my model and said, "Good work, Willa. I'll take it from here." I remember the sickly sweet smell of his cologne and the patronizing pat on my shoulder. I sat in the main conference room, at the very end of the long mahogany table, while he presented my work as a stroke of his own genius. He got the terminology slightly wrong, mispronouncing hyperstatic as hyperstatic, a tiny grating error that only I would notice. The clients loved it. The partners clapped him on the back. My name was never mentioned. After the meeting, one of the senior partners, a man named Arthur, caught my eye. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent acknowledgement that he knew. But knowing and acting are 2 different things. He was a man nearing retirement, unwilling to rock a boat that was sailing him smoothly to a golden parachute. His silent complicity was, in its own way, just as painful. Then there was the time I was passed over for promotion in favor of a new hire, a young man whose only discernible skill was a scratch golf handicap, and a father who played tennis with the firm's biggest client. Monroe had called me into his office, the picture of sympathetic leadership. He said, "Willa, I went to bat for you. I really did, but the board feels we need someone with more client-facing experience." He said it with a straight face, knowing full well that he was the one who refused to let me face the clients. He kept me chained to the drafting table, his secret weapon, while others reaped the rewards of the battles I won. It was a masterful piece of gaslighting. He made me feel like my own deficiency was the reason for my stagnation, not his deliberate suppression of my career. It was during that period of disillusionment that I first met Leo. He was a fresh-faced intern, just out of grad school, with a fire in his eyes that I recognized because it used to be in mine. He was assigned to me, and I took him under my wing. I taught him the software shortcuts, the unwritten rules of structural integrity, the art of making a building sing. He was a quick study, but more than that, he was decent. He saw things. He would watch Monroe sweep in, glance at my screen for 5 minutes, and then stride into a meeting to present my progress as his own. The first time it happened, Leo looked at me, his face a mixture of confusion and outrage. He opened his mouth to say something, but I just shook my head slightly. Not now, not here. We developed our own silent language, a shared glance, a raised eyebrow. He became my confidant, the one person in that entire glass and steel tower who saw the real architecture of our office's power dynamic. He saw who drew the lines and who just traced them. The idea for the QR code, my digital watermark, wasn't born of a single moment of anger. It was an act of slow, methodical self-preservation. It began as a thought experiment on a long, sleepless night after another stolen victory. How could a creator sign their work in a way that couldn't be erased? Painters have their signature in the corner. Writers have their byline. But architecture, especially corporate architecture, is designed to be anonymous, to be the product of the firm. I started playing with the data. The CAD files for structural reinforcement are a sea of numbers and vectors, a language only a computer and a structural engineer can truly understand. I realized that within that language, there was room for poetry. By making minute non-structural adjustments to the length, spacing, and layering of the rebar in a specific grid, I could embed data. It was useless data to the construction process, falling well within acceptable tolerance margins, but it was there, a ghost in the machine. It was my intellectual property, a concept so alien to Monroe that he would never even think to look for it. My resolve to actually use it, to weaponize it, didn't crystallize until a chance encounter outside the office. About a year before the Skyline Tower project began, I was at a city planning commission meeting, just as an observer. Monroe was there, schmoozing, of course. The topic was a new municipal code regarding seismic retrofitting. The lead auditor presenting the new standards was a man named Dr. Aris Thorne. He was the opposite of Monroe in every conceivable way. Where Monroe was smooth, Thorne was sharp. He was a man of pure data, with a reputation for being incorruptible and brutally meticulous. During the Q&A, Monroe stood up and asked a question that was designed to show off, full of jargon he barely understood. Thorne listened patiently, then proceeded to dismantle Monroe's premise with such surgical precision that the entire room went quiet. He corrected Monroe's terminology, pointed out the flaws in his logic, and ended by saying, "Mr. Monroe, it is perhaps better to ensure the foundations of one's own knowledge are sound before questioning the foundations of a city's safety regulations." The public humiliation was exquisite. Monroe turned beet red and sat down. Later I overheard two city engineers talking. One said, "That's the second time Thorne has spanked Monroe in a public forum." The other laughed, said, "Yeah, ever since that hospital wing fiasco 10 years ago, Thorne's had his number." That was the missing piece of the puzzle. An ally. Not a friend, not a confidant, but a fulcrum. A man whose professional integrity was a weapon I could aim. After the live stream of the Skyline Tower presentation ended, I sat in the dark for what felt like an hour. Then I took out my phone. I had one text message. It was from Leo. It just said, "I'm sorry, Willa. That should be your name on that building." That was the catalyst. It wasn't about my own stolen glory anymore. It was about Leo, and all the Leos to come. It was about the fact that Monroe's toxicity wasn't just erasing me. It was poisoning the very profession I loved. It was creating a world where smooth talkers inherited the earth, while the builders, the creators, the ones who actually made it turn, were buried in the foundations. The cold in my veins began to warm. It wasn't the heat of anger anymore. It was the slow, steady burn of pure, unadulterated resolve. I stood up, went to the small locked filing cabinet in the corner of my office, and pulled out a plain black external hard drive. It was time to prepare the package for Dr. Thorne. It wasn't about revenge. I kept telling myself that. It was about correcting the record. It was about architecture. The art of creating structures that are true. And the structure Monroe had built, this empire of lies with him at the top, was about to fail its final inspection. The plan wasn't a spontaneous reaction. It was a blueprint I'd been drafting in the quiet corners of my mind for years. It was a fail-safe, a dead man's switch for my professional soul. Architects are trained to think about contingency, about redundancy, about what happens when the primary systems fail. My career at Monroe's firm was a primary system failure, and this was my emergency generator kicking in. The QR code was the centerpiece, the hidden keystone, but it wasn't just a gimmick I'd cooked up for the Skyline Tower. The concept, the Willa watermarks as I'd privately called it, had been my secret hobby for the better part of 3 years. It started after the Peterson Annex incident, that first raw taste of erasure. I became obsessed with the idea of authorship in a collaborative field. I spent weekends I should have been using for rest or a social life buried in esoteric papers on data steganography, the art of hiding information within other information. I wasn't a hacker, I was an architect. So I didn't think in terms of code, I thought in terms of materials: concrete, steel, glass. The language I knew best. The final version of the watermark was deceptively simple in its logic, but complex in its execution. The steel reinforcement bars, or rebar, in a concrete slab are laid out in a grid. The design of that grid is dictated by thousands of pages of building codes and structural analysis. But within those codes, there are tolerances, acceptable deviations. A bar can be a few millimeters longer or shorter. The spacing can vary by a tiny fraction of an inch. These are rounding errors, construction noise. To me, they became a vocabulary. I wrote a script, a simple plugin for my CAD software. It took a binary input, any data, in this case the data of a QR code, and translated it into a pattern of micro-adjustments in a rebar schematic. A 1 might be a bar that was 2 millimeters longer than spec. A 0 might be a bar that was 2 millimeters shorter. It was a binary language written in steel. It had no impact on the structural integrity. The variations were too small to matter. It was a whisper in a hurricane of structural forces. But I knew that certain technologies, the kind used for deep forensic analysis, didn't just see the hurricane. They mapped every single drop of rain. The technology was called subharmonic material analysis. I'd read a paper on it by a team at MIT. It was a fringe, expensive technology used in things like checking for microfractures in nuclear reactor cores, or analyzing the internal structure of ancient artifacts without destroying them. It sent a complex wave of frequencies into a material, and then read the echoes, the resonance, creating a hyper-detailed 3D map of the object's internal density, down to the millimeter. City auditors would never specify such a scan for a standard building certification. It was overkill, like using a Hubble telescope to look for your car keys. But if an auditor, a respected and meticulous auditor, like Dr. Eris Thorne, received a credible tip about a specific material anomalous in the rebar sequencing of a critical structural zone, he would be professionally obligated to use the best tool available to investigate. He would have no choice but to order the scan. That was the trap. For years, the watermark was just a theoretical exercise, a way to reclaim a tiny piece of my work for myself. On every project Monroe stole, I embedded a small watermark, a simple set of my initials, IWR, hidden in the rebar of a foundation or a shear wall. It was a silent act of defiance, a secret signature only I knew was there. It was my way of carving Willa was here on the inside of the monuments he built to himself. But for the Skyline Tower, his magnum opus, my masterpiece, my initials were not enough. This required the full text. The plain black hard drive I pulled from my filing cabinet was the other half of the plan. It was an encrypted, air-gapped drive that had never been connected to the firm's network. On it was my life's work, meticulously organized. Every project I had ever worked on at the firm was in a separate folder. Each folder contained the initial sketches, the email chains discussing my design solutions, the metadata from the CAD files showing my user ID as the primary creator and editor, and the final renderings. It was a mountain of irrefutable, time-stamped evidence. For the Skyline Tower folder, I had saved everything: screen recordings of my work sessions, early drafts Monroe had dismissed only to later claim as his own ideas, even the audio file from a pocket recorder I'd started carrying, capturing him in a meeting saying, "Don't worry about the technical details, just make it look good. Willa will figure out how to make it stand up." The centerpiece of the hard drive was the video. I had recorded it 6 months ago, sitting in my own apartment, long after the design was finalized. I wore a simple black shirt, no makeup, and just spoke to the camera. I wasn't emotional, I was precise. I laid out the timeline of my career at the firm, project by project, betrayal by betrayal. I explained the watermark system, how the QR code was embedded, and what it linked to. I ended by saying, I am not a victim. I am an architect. And I believe that the truth, like a well-designed building, has a structure that will not fail. I uploaded the entire contents of that hard drive to a series of private encrypted cloud servers, creating the portfolio that the QR code would point to. The domain was a bland, anonymous string of characters, impossible to find unless you had the link. My quiet departure from the firm was the next phase. 2 weeks after the presentation, after the champagne had been drunk and the press releases sent out, I walked into Monroe's office and resigned. I kept it simple. I told him I'd received an offer to work at a small boutique firm, focusing on sustainable residential projects. It was a plausible lie. He was almost magnanimous. He leaned back in his leather chair, a picture of largesse. Well, Willa, he said, we'll be sad to see you go. You've been a great asset in the back office. But I understand. Not everyone is cut out for the big leagues. It was the final, perfect condescension. He saw me as a quiet, mousy subordinate, scurrying off to a less demanding job, unable to handle the pressure of his brilliant world. He had no idea I was the architect of his downfall, and that the blueprints were already complete. I didn't go to another firm. I started my own, Willa Ross Design. It was just me, in a tiny rented office space above a bookstore, with a second-hand drafting table and a powerful new computer. I took on small projects, a kitchen renovation, a deck addition. It was humble work, but it was mine. Every line I drew, every nail and screw, had my name on it. During this time, I maintained my connection with Leo. He was my insider. He would call me once a week, ostensibly to ask for advice on a technical problem, but really to give me updates. He told me how they were struggling to handle the final construction documentation for the Skyline Tower without me. How Monroe had hired 2 senior architects to try and fill my role, and how they were still getting things wrong. He said, "They don't understand the building's soul, Willa. You were its soul." This information was crucial. It confirmed that no one had gone back into the master structural files. My watermark was safe, undisturbed, being woven into the very fabric of the building, kilometer by kilometer of steel. I also did my final research on Dr. Eris Thorne. I spent a week in the city archives, pulling public records on the hospital wing fiasco the engineers had mentioned. It was all there in the dry, bureaucratic language of official reports. 10 years ago, Monroe's firm had designed a new pediatric wing for the city hospital. 6 months after it opened, major structural cracks appeared in the foundation. The investigation, led by Thorne, found that Monroe's team had cut corners on the concrete composition and used a cheaper grade of steel than specified to come in under budget. Monroe had thrown his project manager at the time under the bus, claiming it was a rogue employee. The firm paid a massive fine, but Monroe's reputation survived. Thorne's final report, however, contained a scathing addendum. He wrote, "The ultimate responsibility for a structure's integrity rests with the lead architect, whose name is on the plans. A failure of this magnitude is not a failure of one employee, but a failure of leadership and culture." He knew Monroe was responsible. He just couldn't prove it in a way that would stick. Until now, I was about to give him the evidence he needed, written not on paper, but in the very bones of Monroe's greatest triumph. The plan was complete. The pieces were all in place. All I had to do was wait for the building to be finished. It was the ultimate architectural act. I had designed a structure, and now I just had to wait for the forces of gravity and truth to do their work. For 2 years, I lived a quiet life. I built my small practice, one client, one project at a time. I found a surprising peace in the small-scale work. There was an honesty to designing a space where a family would live, a deck where they'd have summer barbecues. It was real, it was grounded. The Skyline Tower, meanwhile, continued its inexorable climb into the heavens, a distant, silent monument on the horizon, visible from my new office window. I watched it grow, floor by floor, a daily reminder of the clock that was ticking. Leo kept me updated. He'd risen in the ranks, his talent undeniable now that I wasn't there for Monroe to exploit. He was a project manager, trusted and respected. His weekly calls were my only link to that other world. He talked about the escalating costs, the logistical headaches, and Monroe's growing arrogance as the tower neared completion. Monroe was a media darling. Magazine covers, television interviews, a TED Talk about the architecture of ambition. He was selling a story, and the world was buying it. The grand opening was announced for September 15th, a black tie gala. The mayor would be there. The governor. It was billed as the city's social event of the decade. The final certification scans were scheduled, as I knew they would be, for the first week of September. The silent takeover began on a Monday morning, August 28th. I sat at my desk, the sun warming my face, a cup of good coffee, not the stale, burnt swill from the firm's machine, in my hand. I opened a new email on a clean, anonymous email service I'd set up for this single purpose. The recipient was iris.thorn@city.auditor.gov. The subject line was intentionally bland. Query res Skyline Tower Certification, Project #734B. I kept the message itself short, professional, and packed with just enough technical jargon to be undeniable. Dr. Thorn, I wrote. This is an anonymous tip from a party with direct knowledge of the Skyline Tower structural plans. I have reason to believe there is a significant material anomaly in the placement and composition of the steel reinforcements within the primary load-bearing shear walls, on floors 40 through 45. The deviation is not detectable by standard visual or ultrasonic inspection. It presents as a patterned sequence that violates the approved engineering schematics, Ref File S401. To ensure public safety, I strongly recommend a full-spectrum deep resonance scan of this specific zone prior to final certification. The potential for harmonic resonance failure under seismic stress while remote cannot be dismissed. I hit send. The sound of the click was tiny, insignificant, but it felt like I had just pushed the first domino in a line that stretched for miles. For 3 days I heard nothing. It was the most agonizing 72 hours of my life. I tried to work, but I couldn't focus. I kept rereading the email I'd sent, questioning every word. Was it too much, too little? Did it sound like a crank? Or worse, did it sound like a disgruntled ex-employee with a grudge? The self-doubt was a familiar creeping poison. Maybe Monroe was right. Maybe I was just a back-office worker, not cut out for the big leagues. Maybe this grand, intricate plan was just a fantasy, a delusion of a bitter woman. On Thursday afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Leo. It said, "This is weird. A team from the city auditor's office just showed up. Unannounced. They have some very serious-looking equipment. Monroe is losing his mind." A wave of relief washed over me, so powerful, it almost made my knees buckle. The domino had fallen. Thorn had taken the bait. The rest of the day, Leo became my narrator, feeding me short, frantic updates that painted a picture of escalating panic. They've sealed off the 42nd floor. No one in or out. Monroe is in a closed-door meeting with the city guys and our lawyers. Lots of shouting. They're bringing in a deep resonance scanner. I've never even seen one of these before. Looks like something out of a sci-fi movie. I could picture it perfectly. Monroe, his tailored suit suddenly feeling tight around his neck, his confident smile replaced by a taut line of fear. He was a man who controlled narratives, who lived in the world of appearances and handshakes. He was utterly unprepared for a battle fought with hard data and physics. The silence on his end would be the most terrifying thing. He had no explanation for the anomaly, because he didn't know it existed. He would be blaming the steel fabricators, the construction crew, anyone but himself. He would be scrambling, trying to find a story that fit, but for the first time, the story was out of his control. The next day, Friday, Leo called me, his voice a hushed whisper. He was hiding in a stairwell. He said, "Willa, you are not going to believe this. They found something. It's not a flaw, not a crack. It's a pattern. Some kind of code. The tech guys are running it through a pattern recognition filter. Monroe looks like he's seen a ghost. He keeps saying it's impossible, that it has to be industrial sabotage. He's demanding the city arrest the construction foreman." I felt a cold, clean thrill. It was working. It was all working exactly as I had designed it. I just said, "Stay safe, Leo. Don't get involved." He replied, "Involved, Willa? Half the senior staff is already polishing their resumes. They know what this is. This is a kill shot." The news broke publicly, the following Monday morning. Not in the mainstream press, but in a highly respected online journal for structural engineers called The Gantry. The headline was understated but devastating. Skyline Tower certification halted amidst discovery of embedded data in structural reinforcement. The article was meticulously detailed, quoting anonymous sources within the auditor's office. It described the discovery of a sophisticated patterned anomaly that, when analyzed, resolved into a functional QR code. It mentioned that the code, linked to a vast repository of documents, allegedly proving the tower's design, was the work of a single uncredited female junior architect. It didn't mention my name. It didn't have to. The article spread through the architectural and engineering communities like a shockwave. Within an hour, my phone started to ring. It was a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Then another. And another. My email inbox began to fill up. They were from past clients, from rival architects, from headhunters. They all had the same tone of stunned disbelief and dawning realization. The real bombshell landed at noon. A reporter from the city's main newspaper called. She had gotten my name from a source. She had seen the portfolio. She had watched the video. She asked me one question. "Willa, is it true?" I took a deep breath. The quiet was over. I said every word, and I have the files to prove it. The silent takeover was complete. The narrative was no longer Monroe's to control. It was mine. The foundation of his legacy had been scanned, and a truth he had buried for years was now visible to the entire world. The days following the news breaking were a blur of noise and light. My small, quiet life was over. My phone became a perpetually vibrating brick of requests for interviews, comments, and confirmations. My inbox was a digital flood of support from strangers, job offers from prestigious firms I'd once only dreamed of, and, most satisfyingly, panicked inquiries from Monroe's current clients. They weren't just curious, they were scared. The central promise of a firm like Monroe Architectural wasn't just design, it was stability, reliability. The revelation that its star principal was a fraud and that its landmark project was built on a lie shattered that promise into a million pieces. The first major client to defect was a healthcare consortium for whom Monroe's firm was supposedly designing a new state-of-the-art research hospital. The CEO, a sharp woman named Evelyn Reed, had been one of the clients at the Peterson Annex presentation all those years ago. She had been one of the ones who applauded Monroe's genius. She didn't call my office. She showed up. She walked into my little studio above the bookstore, took one look at my humble setup, and then met my eyes with a look of profound respect. She said, "I remember you from the library project. You were the quiet one in the corner. I always wondered where the real work got done." She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She told me her board had put their project with Monroe on indefinite hold. She asked if I would be willing to review the current designs. It wasn't a job offer, not yet. It was a test. It was an invitation. I spent the next 2 days poring over the hospital plans. They were classic Monroe, superficially flashy, but full of lazy, inefficient, and costly structural choices. He hadn't learned a thing since the last hospital fiasco. On the third day, I met Evelyn in her boardroom. I presented my analysis on a single sheet of paper, a list of 27 critical design flaws and my proposed solutions for each. My solutions were simpler, stronger, and would save them an estimated $12 million. Evelyn looked at my analysis, then at her own team of stunned executives, and then back at me. She slid a contract across the table. It was the full design contract for the hospital. The fee was more money than I had ever seen in my life. She said, "We're not interested in a firm. We're interested in an architect. Your name is Willa Ross. That's the name I want on my building." That was the moment the power truly shifted. It wasn't about tearing Monroe down anymore. It was about building myself up. The client exodus had begun. Within a week, 2 more major accounts had pulled their contracts from Monroe, citing a loss of confidence. Leo told me the atmosphere in the firm was a toxic mix of fear and gallows humor. The partners were in endless legal meetings. Monroe was nowhere to be seen. He had gone to ground. His desperate countermove came on a Friday afternoon. It arrived via a bicycle messenger, a thick, creamy envelope containing a cease and desist letter from a high-priced law firm. It was a masterpiece of legal bluster, accusing me of industrial espionage, theft of intellectual property, defamation, and tortious interference. It demanded I take down the portfolio website and issue a public retraction, or face a lawsuit that would financially obliterate me. It was designed to terrify me into submission. The old Willa would have been petrified, but the old Willa was gone. I simply scanned the letter and emailed it to the lawyer I had hired months ago, a specialist in intellectual property law, whose services I'd paid for with the money I'd been carefully saving for years. Her reply came back in less than 10 minutes. It was short and sweet. "This is hilarious. They have no standing. Their entire argument is predicated on the idea that the work was theirs to begin with, which your evidence comprehensively disproves. Ignore it. I'll handle them." The legal threat had fizzled. The next attempt was more personal. That evening, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. It was him, Monroe. His voice was completely different. The smooth, confident baritone was gone, replaced by a strained, hoarse rasp. He said my name, Willa, as if it were a foreign word he was struggling to pronounce. He didn't threaten. He didn't bluster. He pleaded. He talked about the firm, about the people who would lose their jobs. He tried to make me feel responsible for the consequences of his own actions. He said, "We can fix this. Willa, you and me, come back. We'll tell everyone it was a joint collaboration, a misunderstanding. I'll make you a full partner. Your name on the door, right next to mine." It was everything I had once wanted, offered to me now as a bribe to help him bury a truth I had worked so hard to excavate. The offer was an insult, not because of what it was, but because of when it came. He didn't see me as a partner. He saw me as a fire extinguisher. I listened to his entire desperate pitch without saying a word. When he finally ran out of breath, the line was filled with his ragged, anxious breathing. The silence stretched. Then I said, "The time for that conversation, Monroe, was 7 years ago," and I hung up. That was the last time I ever spoke to him. The power had not just shifted, it had been completely transferred. He was trapped in the wreckage of the empire he had built, while I was standing on the solid ground of my own making, with clients who saw my value and a future I was designing myself. The Skyline Tower stood dark and silent, a monument not to his ambition, but to his hubris. He had tried to steal my legacy, and in the end he had only managed to destroy his own. The final confrontation wasn't a dramatic showdown in a boardroom. It didn't happen in a courtroom or a press conference. It happened on a rainy Tuesday, in the quiet, unassuming space that was my new reality. I was in my studio, which was no longer so small. I'd taken over the adjacent office, knocked down a wall, and now had a bright, open-plan space with 3 large drafting tables and a conference area. Leo was at one of them, his head bent in concentration over the initial schematics for the Reed Research Hospital. The smell of fresh coffee and the quiet scratch of his pen on the vellum was the only sound. The bell over the door chimed, and I looked up. It was Monroe. I almost didn't recognize him. The impeccably tailored suit was gone, replaced by a wrinkled trench coat. His face was pale and puffy, his hair unkempt. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week, which I suspected was true. He just stood there for a moment, dripping onto the welcome mat, looking around my office with a kind of dazed incomprehension. He was a king visiting the hovel of the peasant who had overthrown him, and he couldn't seem to process it. Leo looked up, saw him, and a protective hardness came into his eyes. He started to stand up, but I gave him a small shake of my head. I got this. I walked over to Monroe, stopping a few feet away. I didn't invite him in. I didn't offer him a seat. I just waited. He finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. Why Willa? It was the quintessential question of a man who still didn't understand what he had done wrong. He was still looking for a motive he could comprehend. Jealousy, greed, revenge. He couldn't grasp the simple architectural truth of it. You're looking at it all wrong, Monroe, I said, my voice calm and even. You think this was an act of destruction. You see it as tearing something down. I gestured around my bustling new office, at the plans for the hospital, at the bright future taking shape within these walls. This wasn't about destruction. It was about construction. You can't build something new and true on a rotten foundation. I just cleared the site. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. His eyes darted around, looking for an angle, a way to regain control. He fell back on his old tactics. They're going to sue you into oblivion, he hissed, a flicker of his old venom returning. I already have a lawyer, I said simply. But do you? That seemed to deflate him completely. The news had broken that morning. The board of Monroe Architectural, in a desperate attempt to salvage the firm's reputation, had not only fired him, but had also initiated legal proceedings against him personally to recoup the financial damages. They were cutting him loose, leaving him to sink on his own. He stared at me, his mind clearly racing, and I saw the last bit of fight go out of him. He saw no path to victory. He saw only checkmate. I remembered something he'd said to me years ago, after he'd stolen the Peterson Annex design. He'd patted my shoulder and said, "Don't worry, Willa. The most important thing is that the building gets built. Who gets the credit is just noise." I looked him in the eye and gave his own words back to him, a final quiet turning of the knife. Don't worry, Monroe. The most important thing is that the truth gets told. Who gets the blame is just noise. He had no reply. He just turned, a man suddenly looking old and defeated, and walked out of my office, back into the rain. I never saw him again. 2 weeks later, Leo came into my office and put a printout from a trade journal on my desk. The headline read, "Monroe Architectural to Restructure, Rebrand After Founder's Departure." The article detailed Monroe's unceremonious exit and mentioned that the firm was facing a mass client exodus and multiple lawsuits. It happened off-screen, a quiet collapse that was the inevitable result of his own choices. I felt no joy, no schadenfreude. I just felt a sense of balance. The system had corrected itself. The new reality was here, in my studio. My firm, now officially Rose & Associates, was thriving. Leo was my first associate, my partner in this new venture. We hired 2 more talented young architects who had fled Monroe's sinking ship. We were building a team based on talent, respect, and a shared passion for the work itself. My new throne wasn't a corner office in a skyscraper. It was a simple wooden stool at a drafting table, surrounded by my team. It was the head of a conference table where clients listened to my ideas, not because of a fancy title, but because they trusted my vision. We had just won the bid for a new public library, a project that felt like a beautiful poetic closing of a circle. One evening, I was working late, refining the library's atrium design. Leo stuck his head in. "You should see this," he said, gesturing to the large window that faced the city skyline. I walked over and looked out. The Skyline tower, still unfinished, its fate tied up in a legal quagmire, was lit up by the setting sun. For a moment it looked beautiful, a golden spear against the purple sky. Do you ever regret it? Leo asked quietly. The way it all happened. I thought for a moment, watching the light fade on the monument to my stolen work. I regret that it was necessary, I said, but I don't regret clearing the ground. Look at what we're building now. I turned from the window and looked at the plans on my table, at the honest, hopeful structure we were creating together. My vindication wasn't in his fall, it was in my rise. It wasn't in the tower that would forever bear the scar of his lie, but in the buildings we would now create that would bear the signature of our truth.
"Draw up the papers, Peterson," he said, his voice a dead monotone. He didn't look at me. He just stared out the window, at the university he was supposed to command, but which was no longer entirely his. I walked out of his office without another word, leaving him there to contemplate the new reality he had created for himself. The power had not just shifted, it had been permanently transferred. The days that followed were a quiet whirlwind of vindication. Peterson, the university counsel, worked with a speed I had never before witnessed from the administration. The contract for my new consultancy was drawn up, reviewed by Marcus Thorne, and signed within 48 hours. I resigned from my basement cubicle, effective immediately. There was no exit interview. There was no farewell party. I simply packed my small box of personal items and walked out of the administration building for the last time, not as a disgraced employee, but as an independent power. I set up a small one-room office in a building downtown that overlooked the park. It was modest, but it was mine. The first piece of mail I received there was a heavy, cream-colored envelope. Inside was a short, handwritten note from Eleanor Allister. It said, "Shay, I am so pleased you will be continuing your excellent stewardship. The artists of the future are in the best possible hands. Yours, Eleanor." Tucked inside was a check for a separate personal retainer, drawn from her own accounts. The memo line simply read, "For a proper office view." The first official act of my new consultancy was to schedule the quarterly progress report. I flew to meet Eleanor. We sat in her library, just as we had all those times before. I presented the report I had been preparing for months, filled with stories and photographs of the students, the art they were creating, the visiting professors we could now afford. I showed her the vibrant, thriving department her gift was building. She listened, her pale blue eyes bright with interest. When I was done, she simply patted my hand. "You see," she said, "this is what matters, not the noise and the politics. This." The next day, the first $25 million payment was wired to the university's account. The crisis was over. But the landscape had been forever changed. Back on campus, the fallout for Chancellor Hayes was swift and brutal. The story, as these things do in the closed world of academia, began to leak. First, it was whispers in the faculty lounge. Then it was a pointed question at a board of trustees meeting. The narrative was impossible for him to spin. He had, through sheer arrogance and nepotism, lost direct control over the university's single largest endowment. He had created a situation where the university was now paying an external consultant a handsome fee to perform a duty he had declared redundant. It was a fiasco of his own making. Lena kept me updated. Jason, the nephew, was quietly reassigned. He was sent to the athletics department to work on alumni engagement, a hilariously ironic echo of my own punishment. He was gone from the endowment world as quickly as he had appeared. Chancellor Hayes himself lasted another 6 months. His authority was shattered. Every decision he made was viewed through the lens of the Allister debacle. He was seen not as a decisive leader, but as a reckless gambler who had lost a major bet. The board, which had hired him for his reputation as a ruthless cost-cutter, now saw him as a massive liability. A mutually agreed upon resignation was announced at the end of the academic year. He left as he had arrived, a hawk who had been outsmarted by the quiet creatures in the garden. I never spoke to him again. I never had to. The final confrontation had already happened, in that silent, glass-walled office. My victory wasn't loud. It wasn't a shouting match or a dramatic showdown. It was quiet. It was structural. It was permanent. And this is the part I want you to understand. It was never about revenge. I sit here, in my new office, looking out at the green expanse of the park, and I know that in my heart, revenge is about tearing something down. I was never interested in destruction. I was interested in preservation. I had built something beautiful and important, a bridge of trust between a benefactor's dream and a student's future. Hayes and his nephew were trying to dismantle it, to sell it for parts. All I did was enforce the architectural blueprint. I made sure the foundation I had laid was strong enough to withstand the storm. My new reality is calm. It is focused. I spend my days talking to artists, to students, to faculty. I am the steward I was always meant to be, now unburdened by university politics and budget meetings. I am free to do the work that matters. Lena, my loyal ally, was promoted. With Hayes gone, a new, more thoughtful administration took over. They recognized her talent. She is now the head of the university's special collections, a guardian of its history. She and I have lunch every month. We talk about the future, about new acquisitions, about the incredible work the students are doing. My victory lifted her up too. That, to me, is the true measure of success. So for everyone out there who has ever been called redundant, who has been pushed aside, who has watched someone else take credit for their work, I want you to remember this. Your value is not determined by someone else's opinion. It is determined by your competence, by your integrity, and by the things you build. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is have the foresight to build a quiet, unbreakable clause into the contract of your own life. To know your worth and to build the structures to protect it. They can try to erase you. They can try to demote you. But they can never take away what you know and what you have built. In the end, competence is the only currency that matters. And a well-drafted contract is the best revenge of all. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the undervalued architect in your own life, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And please, leave a comment below. I read every single one, and it helps to know that we're all in this together. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about turning the tables and reclaiming your power. Remember, don't get mad. Get strategic.